The Russian-Ukraine crisis is creating a political divide here at home, and eyebrows were further raised over the weekend when former Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard posted this video on Twitter.
There are 25 to 30 U.S.-funded biolabs in Ukraine. According to the U.S. government, these biolabs are conducting research on dangerous pathogens. Ukraine is in an active war zone with widespread bombing, artillery, and shelling, and these facilities, even in the best of circumstances, could easily be compromised and release these deadly pathogens. Instead of trying to cover this up, the Biden-Harris administration needs to work with Russia, Ukraine, NATO, the UN to immediately implement a ceasefire for all military action in the vicinity of these labs until they're secured and these pathogens are destroyed.
Well, Republican Senator Mitt Romney issued a scathing response, tweeting, quote, "Tulsi Gabbard is parroting false Russian propaganda. Her treasonous lies may well cost lives." Hillary Clinton is at you. Others have come out against Gabbard for what they've said is furthering a Kremlin-backed conspiracy. Not the first time she's been accused of this.
Some pointed to 2019 when former presidential Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton, as Kim pointed out, suggested that the Russians were grooming Gabbard to run in the 2020 presidential election. Here's what she said 3 years ago in a podcast with former Obama aide David Plouffe.
"I'm not making any predictions, but I think they've got their eye on somebody who's currently in the Democratic primary and are grooming her to be the third-party candidate. She's the favorite of the Russians."
Joining us now to discuss the renewed rumors is Dr. Rashad Richey, host of Indisputable, and Philip Wegmann, White House reporter for Real Clear Politics. Welcome to you both.
Good morning.
So, Philip, do you think there is an increasing divide in the Republican Party and the elected officials on how to approach this? Gabbard is not a member of the Republican Party, but she's someone who's, I think, much better loved by the right at this point than by anyone in her party, the Democrats. So it was interesting to see Romney go after her, this viciously, really taking the same stance that Hillary Clinton, not a Republican, a Democrat, took a few years ago. Is this just kind of further proof that these lines are being totally scrambled, or people are sorting themselves into different political factions?
It's going to take us some time to figure out where the lines stand after all of this. We're going to have to follow the thread and sort of see what the landscape looks like in terms of left versus right, which is easy for people to follow. But when it comes to more complicated issues, the sort of red versus blue dynamic just doesn't do it. In terms of this conversation, I mean, there are biological research facilities in Ukraine, according to the State Department and others in the federal government. The United States came alongside Ukraine in 2005 and did its best to help them secure these former Soviet labs, and also to help them use these labs in a proper manner, much like our CDC does. That's the line from the federal government thus far. What's interesting is that as we see Tulsi Gabbard deviate from that, rather than having Senator Mitt Romney come out and say, here are the facts, here's actually what's going on, instead he decided to torch her. And his argument is interesting because the former Bain Capital executive goes after her and says that she's committing treason. Not that she's misinformed, not that she has her facts wrong. He says that she is willfully committing treason. I think when you question someone's motives like that and essentially parrot the talking point that we heard from Hillary Clinton during the previous campaign cycle, then that goes from, all right, we're having a discussion about this issue where there potentially can be a lot of misinformation to, I think that you are a bad actor, I question your motives, and therefore you are beyond, you are beyond even having a conversation with.
And Dr. Richey, I've been, highly critical of the turn that, Tulsi Gabbard's taken over the last couple of years, but I was confused by this particular pile-on. It does seem like these labs are of serious concern. If you have dangerous pathogenic biolabs in a war zone, that does seem something that is of concern, not just to Ukrainians and not just to Russians and Europeans, but as we've learned from COVID, a pathogen knows no borders. So what was up with this pile-on here? Isn't she raising something that's of serious concern?
I think she's intentionally taking it out of context. And let's contextualize Gabbard herself. This is not the first time for the rodeo. with her. She's done this before. So there's a hypersensitivity as it relates to her commentary in reference to this. I do agree, this is an element of concern. People should talk about it, but within the proper framework. She took it outside of that proper framework. And let's not forget, she has echoed the conspiracy theory created by Russia, echoed by China, and now wholly adopted by Gabbard. And I think that context is very important when you see people like Mitt Romney and others say this individual is treasonous. Now, it is warranted for conversation for sure. And I think the rebuttal is necessary, especially from the from the State Department and also from the White House. But once again, she has not been a good faith actor with previous commentary, in my opinion, and I think that's part of the pile-on that you see happening to Gabbard right now.
Yeah, treasonous. It was just crazy language. We're not at war with Russia. We're not. How could it be, treasonous to like express your opinion about this issue of concern? That's where it just really went, completely over the top from Romney.
Yeah, perhaps. But once again, we have utilized that terminology, or those on the right in particular, they've utilized that terminology against people like President Barack Obama, against President Joe Biden, and also Secretary Clinton when she was in power herself. So that term has been loosely used. That is actually a legal term that has a legal definition that has not been applied in the social narrative of how we have used it in reference to political opponents in America.
Philip, I'm curious what type of realignment you think might be happening now. I mean, when I see Tulsi Gabbard come out, who, yes, she's coming from the Democratic Party, but I think many of us would argue that she's moved more towards the Republican Party. And we see her saying things that, you've got Mitt Romney, I mean, as we pointed out, calling her treasonous. Hillary Clinton, also part of the establishment machine, calling her a traitor to or a Russian asset of some sort, making that implication. It is like we're having this realignment happening. It kind of reminds me of the 70s when the Democratic Party, actually, the very first government shutdowns, if people remember way back then, was over the Democrats not being able to agree on women's right to choose. And so half the Democrats were pro-choice, half the Democrats were pro-life, and it was a big squabble that they kept having with one another over and over and over again. And so we're seeing that there's this, and of course Republicans had the same sort of disagreements. Some were pro-life, some were pro-choice. And now we see how you're pro-life if you're Republican and pro-choice if you're a Democrat. But almost we're seeing this new shift going on where we're seeing a lot of anti-war Republicans and anti-war Democrats coming together. I would say more anti-establishment. Where do you think this leads? Is there going to be a new realignment, or do you think people will ultimately go back to their corners where they're supposed to belong in their respective parties?
It's interesting that you mentioned the life issue because speaking of realignments, Senator Mitt Romney has had many. At one time, he was actually, pro-abortion. Now he's pro-life. Certainly, he has evolved. I think back to 2008, in particular, when you had the sort of conservative establishment heartbroken that he was going to drop out of the Republican primary. He was seen as conservatives' last best hope. Fast forward, a dozen years or so, and now conservatives are complaining that he's everything that's wrong with the Republican Party. I'm not certain that he has changed so much as we've seen an electorate that is developed an appetite not for the traditional left versus right binary, but instead you have people who, after pretty significant shocks to the system in the last couple of years, whether that was Donald Trump, whether or not that was the pandemic, you have people looking around and saying, actually, it's not just red versus blue. I'm going to look at some of these, folks and look at what they're saying rather than just the labels that they have. I think that overall, as we move forward, we might see voters identifying more with issue sets or more with personalities, and not just with the normal political parties that have dominated thus far.
And Dr. Richey, we've got to run, but any quick last words from you about where you think this all is heading?
Yeah, I think we're going to go back to our corners. There's unprecedented tribalism in both parties right now, and you see that the middle is left out of that conversation primarily. So I do not see this as some great rallying point for a more centric or even a policy-based reality in America. I see politics now where it's completely tribal and unfortunately personality-based rather than policy-focused.
Well, Dr. Richey, Philip, thank you both for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we'll have more Rising right after this. Stick around.